So it's great to have David Colander back at the Summer Institute. Welcome to.
I'm glad there was lunch between Ollie and myself, because I thought Ollie's presentation was absolutely brilliant. It kept me awake, which is very important, and it made a very important point. Right? That will be very parallel to that. I thought the first presentation was great. So first we got a deep, deep philosophical understanding of things, which of course doesn't come across as being very deep, but it is. Then we got a mathematician's version of a deep, deep understanding of things, sort of translated into literary theory. From me, you're going to get nothing deep whatsoever. From me, you're going to get surface analysis, surface understanding. And the reason is because in order to talk about real-world events and not get lost in the footnote upon footnote upon footnote, or the frivolousness of philosophy, you have to blow all that aside and talk about broad brush things as if you understand things that you don't understand and you know you don't understand, but which is useful to put out there to add to the discussion so that people, the community, will discover whatever it is in terms of discovery. And so really sort of view my talk as that part of the superficial, the Cliff Notes, version of, sort of stuff, but designed to make it so we can talk about policy and the policy debates that I think are ongoing now, because that's my interest. I am not interested in the history of economic thought as history of economic thought. I use history of economic thought as a vehicle to understand. So what economists should be saying, what they are saying, to understand economics. So I use it in a quite different fashion. Most historians of economic thought are historians of economic thought. They really get interested in all these little things. I say, tell me what's there. Summarize it, give me the cliff note, and I'll go from there. And I know that's wrong. But I know if I went down 30 levels further, I'd still be wrong. So the issue is, am I more or less wrong here or there? I don't know, because that's a very, very deep issue, and I don't deal with deep issues. I deal with surface. So what you see here is what you get. So I'm talking about laissez-faire activism, and really it's part of what a push for my book that will be coming out. What I'm doing is sort of summarizing a book that I've written with Roland Coopers, who's a physicist, sort of trying to sort of say, here, if we understand complexity, what do we have to say about policy, and what can we say? And so it's talking about, here, can we get a complexity frame for economic policy? So that's what the book is attempting to do, and that's what I'll be trying to do here today. And what I'm going to argue is essentially that if you take complexity theory and understand it, it leads to classical liberalism. Exactly, sort of where people were then, in a very, very deep way that has been lost in the way we teach economics. So if you're asking for one summary of that, it is once you understand complexity theory, so you're pushed back to classical liberalism. Okay. And I'm not going to take questions, sort of until the end, because, sort of you will destroy my line of thought. And remember, I'm only surface, so the only thing there is the line of thought.
I was going to reject the idea of complexity theory being surface, so you're going to just want you to admit that you are simplifying something that in fact is deep.
My understanding of complexity theory is surface. My understanding of everything is surface. So that went without saying. If you had listened to me before, you would have understood that. Okay, so what I'm talking about is changing the frame of policy from a control theory frame to a complexity theory frame. And, so the central narrative of complexity science involves viewing the economy as a complex, evolving system that really becomes beyond the control because it's evolutionary. Hayek understood that very well. And really, reading Hayek is reading somebody who understood that the economy was complex and trying to sort of fit that in. And it's just so wonderful to read Hayek and then to see he was connected with all the people doing complexity theory. That was his group of discussion. That was what was going on and how little that influenced, economics that's there. So it sees itself in the social system as a complex and adaptive, developing multiple endogenous control mechanisms that make it work, and which are continually evolving over time. Government is just one of the components of these endogenously evolved control mechanisms. Okay? So that's what I pull out of complexity theory. Now, if I talk to complexity theorists, they say, oh, that's just surface, and it is only surface. But, it allows me then to move to sort of the next step. So the central policy choice in the complex frame is not going to be, should we have the market or the government? That whole discussion of market versus government is itself nothing but a reflection of the frame that economists have put on the way they look at the economy. And that goes back to the Lerner discussion that we had earlier. It is not sort of the market or the government. The goal of policy and complexity frame is not to choose one or the other. The policy is seen as affecting the complex system in a way that cannot be controlled. So you can't talk about the economics of control. You might be able to talk the economics of influence. Whose influence, how, what it'll be. Those are all extraordinarily complicated and difficult questions. But those are the questions, that have to be asked. Within this complexity frame, top-down control, if you're going to have it, is really only the absolute last resort. It means you blew it in sort of designing the system so that it could go on. And there's no designer, so you're constantly going to say, here it is, there, and you're deciding, should I pretend that I'm in control or not? Very much, I have a whole part of discussion, it's like parenting. And, I'm, sort of see the government as a parent. But a parent cannot control their kids. The kids are going to do whatever they want. And the only approach to parenting is laissez-faire. Which means you try to influence in a positive way and you hope it has some positive results, but you don't try, sort of controlling that. So what I'm going to argue is really when we look at classical liberalism, there were wide ranges of views. I think that's already been discussed. Sort of in Smith, others, as to how, it would happen. Classical liberalism is totally consistent with that. Mill fits within that. Even the later Mill. Even Keynes, I'm going to argue, fits as a classical liberal. Oh. Sorry. So, it's there. The question is then not, what is our theory? The question is, how do we carry it out in practice? And you often do things you hate to do as a parent and as a classical liberal. But because you feel it is necessary at this point in time, so you can only understand the policies that are undertaken, what's there, by understanding the temporal context within which that policy is taken. And when economists express policy views, they are not policy views for all times. They are policy views for particular social situations at particular times. And you cannot translate one from the other. Which is why Keynes, of course, was known for having 30 different positions on every single policy that was out there. He was trying to parse it in a different way than most people who call themselves classical liberals would. But in terms of methodology, in terms of the way he understood the economy, he was a classical liberal because that's what all the people trained as economists were. That's what it meant to be an economist at that time, was to accept this framework, which was a complexity framework. So, within that, what we get are theory and models are heuristics, and they're only heuristics. They're helpful for solving particular problems at particular times. They are not true. And I presented this, I sort of attacked DSGE models, and we had a hearing in Congress attacking DSGE models. It was the only one, they've ever had sort of on an intellectual topic. And, because there were a lot of people in, government who were unhappy with DSGE models. And I introduced it as, with the lamppost joke, which I'm sure all of you know, so I'm not going to tell it, but it's up there. But of course, here, economists were searching for the keys where the light is. Now, that sounds kind of stupid. And critics like to complain about, economics because of that. I argue that's totally what economic theorists should be doing, is searching where the light is. If you don't search where the light is, where the hell are you going to search? Going to search out there in the dark? No, you search where there's light, and you try and develop more light. That's what theory is about. The only thing is, you don't think you're searching for the keys. What you're searching for is an understanding of the topography of the system. Then you have some people out there in the dark, wandering around, sort of feeling, does this topography match that topography? Oh, then maybe this might be useful for this particular time. And there's lots of different topography. You've got to tie them together. But there's a whole different set. Sort of what I call the finders out there. People who understand the institutional structure. That we don't train any economists in, or anybody in. But that is absolutely necessary in order to apply what theorists do. And by theorists, I mean good theorists, who are really pushing the envelope. And that uses the ultra math, not the math, that you see in graduate school. That's just diddly squat. This is stuff on coalgebras, that are operating, that include self-reflective systems within that. I don't understand any of it, but the people I'm talking to there tell me that this will resolve some of the problems because you have a different compiler. And there's a group of really top mathematicians struggling and working on this. That's what mathematicians and economic theorists should be doing. And the rest of us should be out there feeling around, doing superficial stuff. But getting lessons and sort of integrating with theorists. But theorists want to talk about policy. And I don't object to them doing theory. I object the hell to them talking about policy as if they know about it and theory gives them some sense. Now, some of them do. But a lot of them don't. So that's why I wrote this paper, why reporters should never turn to Nobel Prize winners for advice on policy. Because the Nobel Prize is given for economic science. That's not about economic policy, and the two are quite different. Complexity policy, there, is going to be focused on creating the ecostructure for the system, for operating. So the policy, once you're down there, you're really way too specific to talk about policy. If you're going to do policy as an economist, you have to be talking not about that which is going to be driven by politics, but about the meta level, the meta-meta level, and everything else. How can we create that system which will allow it to go, because there you can have some influence. Classical liberals, that's what they were worried about. When they say laissez-faire, they're saying, here, we have a complex system. The best way is to give individuals freedom. Let it develop, let it evolve. And it will, do the best. We're not sure it'll do the best, but hence that's our sense. And, you can't try and control it, because here are examples whenever you try to control it, and it goes wrong. So it's a historical sense that here, every time you have government entering in, it screws things up. So we don't want government entering in. But then, unless you have that system that allows for it, it's there. And that's sort of the tension in Hayek. Of course, he's sort of pushing, we don't want government doing anything. But, you can see that tension again in Chicago, the early on. They wanted government to do something to create the structure, a positive program of laissez-faire. So here talking about that structure, all that talk, all that discussion has moved out of economics. It's not taking place, and it should. So what this is really an attempt to bring that discussion back as to what's going on. So in the same way that we talk about business and innovation, sort of leaving people free and sort of operating, the same thing has to do with policy. Sort of trying to design the system so it can evolve, and that's really what is pushed there. Now, this is a book I've written and hope for a broader audience, sort of what I call the New York Review of Books audience. The ones who read Lee Krugman, which is pretty awful. But, sort of to really be seen there. And, sort of for them, I'm bringing up the Leonard Reed story, which most of you should know is about iPencil. So iPencil told him his story. And that's usually used by market fundamentalists sort of as a way of saying, isn't the market absolutely wonderful? So I went out, interviewed iPencil 9, the 9th generation after iPencil, and talked about how pencils now develop and take place. It's much, much more complicated and much more difficult than there. The wood, which he said came from Washington. It doesn't come from Washington anymore because Washington has regulations that you can't do it. It comes from Malaysia, and it's brought there. And sort of I go through the various elements. Some of it I don't discuss because essentially it's much easier to watch it on the web. There's wonderful stories about how pencils are produced, making all the points much more easy than what could be read in sort of a book where you have to read. If you can see something in a picture and get the same understanding, why read? And so, so that builds in. So there, so in it, I talk about the lead problem. And the lead problem is not the lead that's in the pencil, that's graphite. The lead problem was the paint that they used. The paint had lead in it. Kids would chew on it. And as they chewed on it, they got, so sick. And it hurt them. The producers didn't want to hurt them. And there were regulations not, they were happy with the regulations. They worked with the group. You change the nature of paint. There's now, they used to have 9 levels of paint. Now there's only 1. But you only need 1 because you've improved the technology. So I discuss all this. But how all that came about, I discuss. And the understanding that comes from it, every part of that required some aspect of government, some aspect of something else, sort of that contributed to help solving the problem. Now maybe that wasn't the best way or not. I don't know what the best way is. But it was the way it came about. So the market and the government are like an odd married couple. They're stuck together. They're glued at the hip that you can't discuss one without the other. The market structure depends upon the government structure and vice versa. So you have to talk about both of them or conceive of both of them as a composite whole. Now, for certain problems, you might choose not to. But for the general problem, the general frame of reference, it's really important to see them joined at the hip and how to do it. So that's, sort of the story that, I tell there. Now within there, here's my argument that Keynes is the classical liberal. And it goes back also to the methodology that Keynes used. I've written a number of pieces on his methodology. And then he followed his father, John Neville Keynes, sort of practicing what I call art in there. But I just wanted to quote, sort of, Keynes's letter to Hayek, congratulating him on the road to serfdom. Keynes wrote, "It was a grand book," and he wrote that morally and philosophy I might find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it, and not only in agreement with it, but in deeply moved agreement. Now, many people who see themselves as Keynesian today think of Hayek's views as the total antithesis of Keynes. That is not the way it is. There's an enormous amount of agreement between Keynes and Hayek. Now, on particular policies at particular times, they came to quite different positions, but that's different than the meta frame of the way they're thinking about it. And what happened, Keynesian got destroyed because it got put in a different meta frame. In the same way that classical liberalism got destroyed because it got put in a different meta frame. And they were put in two contrasting meta frames as being seen in a composite meta frame that then allowed one to have different positions and views. Talk a little bit about the current policy frame, and I've looked a lot at this, and a number of the chapters sort of go through it, but I'm just going to briefly go through that, and that's the economics of control. And in the book we use Lerner in both macro and micro because he was extraordinarily influential in both. Not because he had a deep understanding of things, he did, but because he had a shallow understanding of things. Shallow understandings of things is wonderful for teaching because students cannot get deep things. Students can only get shallow things because that takes a long time to get deep things. And so that which wins in the pedagogical battle are shallow things. And Lerner could sort of translate ideas into very shallow ideas that captured some shadow, some essence of the idea that was there, but did not convey the deeper understanding that's there. And that's exactly what I'm arguing happened in the Walrasian neoclassical revolution. Not the neoclassical, not the marginalism, not from 1870 up until 1930. There, if I read Marshall, I see all of classical liberalism still involved. But if I read, sort of after that, if I start reading in the 30s, starting with Hicks, and Hicks would later repent, but not. Then with Lerner, a variety of people, sort of who were interpreting it, because what you wanted to do was to put it into a newfound technology. And that newfound technology was, here, we've got some mathematics, general equilibrium mathematics, that we can put it together and see how the whole economy interrelates. Isn't it neat? We can solve problems. So Marshall had this partial equilibrium framework. And here we only understood part, but if you added these, other issues, it would negate sort of the rules that he had. And you could show that. And that led to all kinds of publications for all kinds of people, and they moved up and they became it, and that became economics. Sort of playing that game and extending that particular model that was out there. So that really got developed, and it was Paul Samuelson who did it, because not only in his foundations, which replaced Lerner as sort of the graduate text, but in his textbook, written in the 50s, that became the template for what people learned and what people thought was economics from 1950 until today. And what that did is, what Samuelson did was to use Lerner's framework to make it understandable and put it there. Sort of these things. And what he did, so what you did is to say, here you have a market, and you're operating on that market, and then we have a control, the government. And the market generally works wonderful. That they accepted. Except for these problems. We have externalities, increasing returns, monopoly. We can sort of go through them. But that's no problem. Then the government just comes in and makes the adjustments, and turns the knobs, and we get the optimal outcome. So you're talking about efficiency, optimal outcome coming up. That's the frame within which policy is presented. That's the way we think of policy. That's the way students are taught in both micro and macro. As if we have somebody in control, the government, and we have a market out there that would work perfectly, but for these problems. But that goes against the two are connected at the hip. Because what it does is draw both together. Now in a paper Craig and I did, we sort of looked at Chicago. Why did Chicago fundamentalism develop? We argue that it was because this model developed. This control model that sort of said, here, government can improve it. That's not right, Friedman said, and it isn't right. So therefore, we have to have another argument. Well, Friedman wasn't the only one saying that. You had the entire older Chicago, which was classical liberal. But they were talking philosophy. And now it moved to math and moved to empirical work. So the way in which Friedman could market his ideas was to restructure it and say it there. So then we developed market fundamentalism. Now, when they had Coase up there, and Coase gave his seminar, and Stigler said, wow, this is pretty good, because now we can use Coase's argument, that essentially here the market will solve everything, simply by leaving it here. There's no problem of externalities, there's no problem of everything. So here we have our foundation. So now we have our two positions. One, the market fundamentalists, and one here, the market control people. We're totally lost sense that they're connected at the hip. But what came first was the market control. The other was a reaction to it. Classical liberalism got left out of the entire picture there, sort of lost. What people were interested in, the complexity of the system, because people stopped talking about complexity and were talking about simple systems, control systems. Indeed, the DSG models are still control models. They're control models when you're looking and have people forward looking, but the whole way it's structured is within control models. So I argue they are nothing more than sort of a continuation of, sort of this particular process that's going on. Which sort of brings me sort of to the complexity policy frame, which says the two are connected, sort of at the hip, you're going there. How are you going to talk about anything if you have a complex system of which government's a part you have no control of? That's where Hayek was. We've got to keep government out of talking about it. And that sort of was adopted, that people who favored the market were essentially making complexity arguments without the government being connected. Well, all I'm doing is saying here the government's connected, so we got to figure it out. Government evolved to solve problems that existed in the market. It probably wasn't the best way to solve their problems, but that's what we have to be talking about. And are there alternative mechanisms that can better solve those problems? Because that's the only thing that's really interested for policy. So the complexity policy frame begins with a vision of the social system as a complex evolving system where all elements of the system co-evolve, including government. It's continually in the process of reorganizing. At best, any agent or institution comprising a complexion of agents has a measure of influence. And that's it. We all have influence, any particular one thing. And what one has to look at is sort of how that influence works and how it can help to achieve what the individual from that perspective thinks will be better, if you're worried about social. It doesn't say it's better or anything else. Remember, I'm only a surface person. Everything is only what people think will be better. So an activist laissez-faire policy is a policy designed to create a viable eco-strict system in which individuals solve social problems from the bottom up without the use of a central coordinator. As opposed to imposing social goals on people, top-down, activist laissez-faire policy is a bottom-up policy that focuses on creating that eco-stricture and encouraging people's social dimension. And here it differs from a lot. People have social dimensions. They worry about it. Entrepreneurs worry about it. Rich people worry about it. But they don't want government coming and taking their money and doing it. They want to do it as they see it, to achieve their social goals. So you design the system to encourage people to follow their social goals. How much time do I have or what?
Well, if you finish by about, say, 10:02, that'll give us
Okay, just
45
as
minutes to
I'm
talk.
trying to figure out, since I haven't allowed anybody to say much, I'll try and do it. I go in there and discuss, sort of technical issues, which might be of interest to you. How, sort of economists lost this complexity view. And I do it in both micro and macro. And the story's told around Apple Warmer because he's just so wonderful. Plus, I wrote a book with him, so it sort of works out nicely. So, sort of it's there, here, so you have this sense. And it was the way in which it fit within the institutional structure. It wasn't anybody decided this was the best way. People fully understood all the other issues. These are not issues people don't understand. The system evolves quite separately from people's understanding. And, sort of in it, I discuss a whole bunch of things that got pushed out that I want to briefly discuss here. Number one, within the debate, this market fundamentalist versus government debate, neither side questioned the role of norms in policy, cultural norms, which are extraordinarily important, and any influence government might have on cultural norms, positive or negative. Neither side questioned the activities that people undertook that could feed back on what other people wanted. Tastes are endogenous. We all know that. Yet our models say, here, tastes are given. How do you deal with that? How do you control that? And how do you even discuss talking about controlling when tastes are endogenous? Neither side questioned the assumption of perfect rationality. That they're modifying now. Neither side questioned whether material welfare, as a measure of welfare, was appropriate for social welfare. If you look at the early discussions, economics used to be defined as the study of material welfare. With the understanding here, there's this whole other part of welfare that we don't touch. That's why they had two different definitions of utility. One being, sort of that which was relevant for material welfare. One was for a much broader sense. That was going on. All these got discussions. It's wonderful sort of reading, sort of the early stuff on social welfare functions. They were social welfare functions, and in the article, he has, and what we'll do is assume all the social issues away and talk about an economic welfare function. So what was initially discussed was we're talking about an economic welfare function. Samuelson translated that into a social welfare function and moved out and forgot. Here, there's all these variables that have been left out. If you're talking about control of this complicated system, they get brought back in to talk about it. Neither side questioned how morality fit into the policy discussion. It was here as a technical problem. You're maximizing something. Where's freedom? Where is, sort of your moral views, the complicated stuff that utilitarians were fighting with others about? Which is why I asked the question about Sen. And I had worked and studied with Sen. So, sort of it's there, and he had his own particular views on where that fit in. But do we teach any students that here, these are all fundamentally important? No, we don't. And I continue on with things that were sort of pulled out. What got pulled out of macro was, of course, all Keynes' sensibility. Sort of, and what got included in macro is just an abomination. And that's for the record. Okay, then I talked a little bit about the relation of complexity. And what I'm doing here is summarizing chapters in the book that sort of we discussed. The relation of complexity theory to nudge and the discussions there with sort of what you have in behavioral economics and the movement in behavioral economics to try and apply that to policy. And what I argue is they get it wrong. And the reason they get it wrong because they're trying to append it onto the standard frame. So what you're doing is saying, here, we accept that people are more complicated, that they're not rational, that they have these beliefs. Now we're saying, here, this modifies the economist's discussion in some degree of policy. It doesn't. If you accept that, you don't have the complexity frame. You don't have the standard for policy frame. It destroys it. So you can't add nudge on to something that you've destroyed. And yet that's what it attempts to do. And then I discuss, sort of there. I wanted to leave some time to sort of present a presentation I just gave last week at the Social Impact Summit at Harvard Law School. There were about 160 people involved, all the social entrepreneurs, all those liberals that you guys will hate. So that's my natural, sort of sense. That's where I fit. That's where I belong. And, sort of talking to them, sort of pushing, sort of the idea that I have. So I thought I'd give very close to the same talk. It was a very short talk to you. Because my hope is, of course, that, this will bring together both sides in common understanding of here is what is useful to take out of complexity. and here's what not. And it changes the policy discussion. And it's really about for-benefit corporations. And that's what I've been working on now. And I'm a sort of person who deals in sort of this policy, how can we change things? And sort of a for-benefit institution, what is it? It's an institution that maximizes the owner's utility. What's the difference between that and a for-profit institution? A for-profit institution is one that assumes that people's utility only includes material welfare. And I can go through the history of why it developed and how it developed, but it did. And so, I'm working on a paper now on why corporations should not maximize utility or maximize profit. Because if the owners can say, here, we can better achieve our social ends, not by giving money to nonprofits, because, this developed when some entrepreneurs called me and talked to me and said, we made, they were people who made hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. We made all this money and we're unhappy because we give it to these nonprofits, and guess what? It doesn't achieve the ends we want. That's how the whole social impact movement got going. We want to change things, and the question is how. And sort of, that's where this for-benefit structure. Here, by creating corporations, or flexible purpose corporations, they're called, and in California, so there's a law, I can tell you all about fights through B Corps and a lot of these others there. But these flexible purpose corporations are simply saying, here's our goal. Here's the goal of their, and we're going to achieve it. Now, we can achieve it in a whole variety of ways. One of those is to make profit. Newman's Own, for example, tries to maximize profit, and then use that profit and say, we're going to use this profit in a certain way. It may be that, it may be something else. How it works out is not for any government or anybody else to decide. It's for the individual entrepreneurs to decide. What one wants to do is free them up, not place any restrictions on them whatsoever. And the current institutional structure we've developed places enormous restrictions on them as to how it operates. And so it's trying to change that institutional structure to be more conducive to for-benefit institutions. Now I go back and, the reason they keep inviting me to all these things, so I've been at a bunch of them, is because I go out and say, sort of Adam Smith was not about greed. All of you know that because he wrote the theory of moral sentiments. Long before that, Wealth of Nations was an addendum, an adjustment. That here, to say here when people try to sort of do good, they often do bad. So here is a way to do good. But they were very much worried at the time in terms of, so entrepreneurs want to do good. So that was just, I went through. At the time, classical economists saw that there was a problem. And the problem was people were starving. And when people are starving, guess what's most important? Material welfare. And they designed a system, and that's what they talked about, material welfare. They expected, in Mill, that's why I go back to Mill's sort of vision of his stationary state. People would grow out of that. They all expected profit possibilities are going to end. They should end. And then we'll modify and change our system to deal with, these problems when we don't, our needs are met. Wants can be unlimited. And how wants and needs interrelate are an extraordinarily important policy issue that isn't discussed, that should be discussed. I'm not saying I have any answers, but it's part of what should be the discussion. So then this thing from Keynes, of course, which is from his economic possibilities of our grandchildren. But I also had some quotes from Mill in that. When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. All kinds of social customs and economic practices affecting the distribution of wealth and the economic rewards and penalties, which we now maintain at all costs, however distasteful and unjust, makes them love me up there, Harvard, they may be in themselves because they are tremendously useful in promoting the accumulation of capital, we shall be then free at last to discard. So they expected this change. And remember, I see Keynes as part of this classical liberal tradition. The activist part of it, indeed, but still part of the same tradition that talked about a much broader policy in a much broader way. And that's what I mean by the classical liberal tradition. It isn't associated with any political or any view one way or the other, but it's a way of framing the discussion where one is open to all parts of discussion of where change is possible, as opposed to an extraordinarily limited frame that doesn't allow discussion of where I call the real possibilities, the $100 bills on the table, on the ground. What we've done with marginalism is reduced everything to collecting quarters of pennies here and there. And that's what we spend all our time discussing policy about. When the $100 bills that are just lying there, if we're willing to sort of turn economists' way of understanding things to these broader sets of issues, can fundamentally change the world. And sort of then I go to hear what the goal is for these four benefit ones. It allows people to blend doing good and doing well. Now you can see lots of tension, at least in ritzy liberal arts schools like one I teach, of students who want to go out and do good, but they want a job. How do you fit those two together? So four benefit institutions are there. So there's a whole social entrepreneurship movement that's there. I've been to some of them. They're all touchy-feely. They don't have any of sort of the economic sensibility. So last one I went to, I made myself totally persona non grata, because I said, this is touchy-feely. What you guys need are some skills, some understanding of what's going on.
Reality check.
And, sort of, the students came up and said, we really agree. The others came up and said, who are you? The key is to build it in the DNA of, sort of the structure, of the institutional structure. If it's not built into the DNA of the structure, if social goals aren't, they're not going to be achieved. Government can't achieve them. It has to be built in, and it has to be built in from the bottom up. And I ended, of course, is that Milton Friedman could support for-benefit firms, as could any classical libertarian. So that's why I thought I'd present it here to really get myself done. Because if the corporate charter includes goals other than profit, then the goal of the corporation should be to achieve those other goals, not profit maximization. Profit maximization is not the central one. The central one is, here are the goals of the people. We need more reflection of the people organizing, taking on about what those goals are, as opposed to leaving social goals to government, which is going to screw it up. It has to remain with the individual where freedom is there. I did that for you guys. So thank you very much.